Good morning, my name's Linda Jackson and we're carrying on with our Poets Time interviews. Beautiful day up here in Glasgow, and we're now towards the end of September, and COVID again still around. You know, are some of us older ones getting the booster? Will the children take the booster? Will the children take it at all? So we're still living in that and people are dealing with it. And I have recently read the poetry of a man sitting next to me here, Bob Beagrie, and he has written outstanding work on the pandemic. It has become a bit beleaguered for me to read work on the pandemic until I found this chap's work. My God. So we're very, very fortunate today on this sunny day. It looks sunny where he is too. Bob's from Middlesbrough and he lives in Middlesbrough, teaches at University of Teesside, and he has 11 collections of poetry. Grace and magic coming out of them. I've been looking at this book, Remnants, which has got some wonderful illustrations. So the two things to go together really well. And I've been reading quite a few of his poetry books. His latest collection, I'll have to read it out because it's like a novel itself, is When We Wake, We Think We're Whalers. And that's published by Stairwell Books. And I think Bob's going to read from that today. Without more babbles from me, I want to pass you on to this wonderful poet. This is Bob Beagrie.
Hello, Linda. It's a delight to be able to chat to you. So, yeah, I thought you asked me to choose 4 poems, so I thought it would make sense to read from Whalers because it's my new book and I'm trying to promote it really. So I thought I'd read a few from that. So I'll read 2. And then maybe another one from it later on. As you said, it deals a lot with experiences of the pandemic. Most of these poems in here were written during 2020 and early 2021. I thought I'd start with this prose poem called Blowing Out. Now, I wrote this in March 2020. It was a couple of days before the first lockdown, and my dad had a heart attack and was rushed into hospital, and he was unconscious. And it was, I mean, he survived and he's fine now, but it was a very worrying time, especially because COVID cases in hospitals were starting to rocket, and I managed to go and see him in the intensive care, but I had to get all fully PP'd up. And the thing is about this book, now that we're 18 months into it, getting on for 2 years, we kind of acclimatized and normalized lots of things. But when I was when the book came out in June and I read through it again, I was immediately taken back to the kind of intense sense of uncertainty and dread and kind of surreal panic that we've all lived through, but we've kind of like packaged that in a way in order to get on with our lives. But I think that's what this book kind of captures quite well. But anyway, this one especially because it's about going to visit my dad in the intensive care unit. Now, my dad was a bricklayer, and all through my teenage years, every weekend, I was always working with him for a bit of extra pocket money on govy jobs. Blowing out. My dad is building a wall, twirling bricks in the air, bedding them down in a quarter round, flicking the trowel to lay a mat of fresh darbo. With one brick after the next, in a cheeky wink of an eye, the edifice rises, and so does the scaffold, but no one can tell what he's building. He has abandoned the architect's plans. A loose crowd has gathered, observing social distancing as speculations spread. He's building a new Tower of Babel. It's the new walls of Jericho, Jerusalem, kingdom come. He's making a stairway to heaven. It's a folly, it's a marvel. It's a sanatorium free from the sickness. It's a dam to stop both tide and time. He's building a Neverland where anything goes. You move through the space trying to touch as little as possible, and would, if you could, lighten yourself so your feet could lift a few inches from the floor. Over the last few days, we've all been made more attentive to the auras that surround us, our own personal biospheres of electromagnetic energy. Even if most can't see them, as some more mystically attuned people claim to, we recognize their potentially infectious existence. And the ventilator makes another regular sigh. Your mind is a sanitized side room full of bleeps and whirs where the familiar names of things melt and orientations blur. The white tiled floor is the wall at your back, a compact and undeniable once upon a time, too solid and certain to look out with anything more than a furtive glance. The ceiling's expanse is the hazy horizon line where the North Sea kisses the foot of the sky, towards which you have tossed how many memories with the expert flick of the wrist. The pane of glass into the ward is a TV screen showing a soap opera you assumed you inhabited, filling the void with all those familiar roles and routines. And the ventilator makes another regular sigh, a slow mechanical exhalation. You know, Nirvana literally means blowing out, an emptying, a quenching, a sluicing of self into sunyata through the gates of 10,000 things. Magpie hordes, tower blocks, get well cards, daisy chains, fish grills and razor blades, the sightless eyes of a forest of needles through which a caravan of dromedaries trudge toward a sunset, their two-toed splayed feet sinking into the dust dunes of lost civilizations, misplaced wedding rings, rune casts, pollen-coated bee fur, shipping forecasts, Michael Portillo's voluminous nostrils, the signatures drying on birth and death certificates, and Yul Brynner intoning, etc., etc., etc. And the ventilator makes another regular sigh to the bleeps, chirrs, and whirs of the electronic menagerie. Your blood flows through transparent tubes into the dialysis machine and back into your body, a conservatory for your circulatory system. My dad's building is a miraculous wall, and no one can guess what it's part of, but he looks so much younger than he should. Outside the sealed room of your sedated mind, the world serpent constricts its coils, and its freshly brewed venom transmits between persons more infectious than a giggle in a school assembly, as paranoid and undiscerning as a lynch mob in the grip of mass hysteria, as profound and transformational as love released from the moorings of desire. Thank you. I'll read this one as well. This is another. There's lots of prose poems in this book. And I'm not. Until I wrote this book, I'd never really explored prose poems. But I really enjoyed doing it. And in a way, the experience and the emotions I was feeling throughout the lockdown I felt couldn't be kind of contained in traditional verse form. So I found the prose poem much more suitable and give me a liberty to play in a new way, really. So this one's called Pantheon, and it's about the ghosts in Llandudno that went AWOL and rampaged around the town. They say the ghosts of the great worm have come careering down off its shoulders to rampage around the deserted town and live deliciously. Footage of the boisterous trip was shown on the evening news. Their creamy fleeces, a bubbling splurt of surf spilling through people's gardens and across the roads, ignoring giveaway signs. They nibbled the hedges and flower beds, climbed on walls, town benches, danced on tables in abandoned beer gardens, and their horns scraped against trees and keyed parked cars, rattling against grates to make their capricious music. Obviously, having a whale of a time while the townsfolk wait out their quarantine, penned in restless living rooms. The footage was filmed during the day, But after nightfall, the mood of these shaggy, insatiable marauders alters. They have taken to lighting candles and placing between their horns while staring into the windows of people's homes, licking their lips, whispering dark delights of living a life of lusty abandon. They tap their horns against the double glazing, rub their cheeks against brass door handles, snuffle wild promises through letterboxes, and prance through sleepers' keratin dreams, bleating, "Once upon a time, you were as free as me." Let those memories stir up a perfect storm. Come out to play, let's swallow the dawn. With each passing day, their numbers grow.
Yeah, fantastic. I thought it was very interesting what you were saying there, Bob, about the, the containment of a poem. And in lockdown, that was refused in some way by you. I don't know if you're making, like that whole penned in thing anyway. And then the way you literally are penned in by a poem by the restrictions of poetic form. And then you discover the prose form. So it's like a liberating thing in some way. I found that really interesting.
Yeah, I definitely found it a liberating way to play, and it just allowed me to follow thoughts in a way that was a lot freer.
Yeah.
And I was writing every day. I'd just get up and I'd write. And it was a cathartic experience, really, because I was going through some quite difficult emotions, and the prose poem really allowed me to just follow the thoughts and emotions to the natural conclusion.
I think it's a really interesting idea to think about a creative person, or most people creative, but somebody who's developed that like yourself. And I know the 2 years you had, apart from the pandemic, obviously you told your father, and I know about your wife, her illness twice, very seriously during the time. So I think there's something really interesting about the way you feel boxed in some way and helpless, and as a creative person, you have to get something out. So it's like just letting all these ideas just come forth. I mean, there's something, I heard you reading the one about the goats, which people laugh at because it is funny, because you've got that kind of unusual collocation of almost biblical scenes and, religious imagery combined with goats just running amok, really, and us penned in our living room and them scraping the side of things, so it's this, I think that creates the humour itself. But I wanted, if you could, because you talk about the serpent earlier, and now this is the goats of the great worm. Can you say something about how religious imagery comes into this poem, or your poetry in general? Yeah, are you religious? Are you religious, Bob? You brought up religious?
No, and I'm not religious now, but I do draw upon a lot of I wouldn't say religious, but archetypal. Yeah. And obviously religious scriptures are just full of archetypes, so I draw heavily upon archetypal figures within my poems. I'm really interested in trying to capture a kind of mythopoeic worldview. Yeah. A lot of the stuff that I've written, well, I've written a few books that are set in different historical periods. So Leesung Spell is set in like 7th century Northumbria. I've written a book called The Seasong Husband that was set during the Henrican Reformation Tudor times. And that's about Tobias Shipton, who was the husband of Old Mother Shipton. I don't know if you've heard of Old Mother Shipton, but she was the witch and prophetess of Yorkshire in the 16th century and lived in Knaresborough. And a lot's known about her, but very little about her husband, who was a carpenter. And so I wrote her story through his perspective, really.
Sounds absolutely incredible. I need to get hold of that one. I mean, I think it just seems, it's just a poet actually just drawn to narrative, whether it's mythical narrative, storytelling in a very beautiful and poetic way. I mean, when I'm listening to the one of your dad, and I'm glad he's better, he sounds a formidable creature. When you're talking there about the stories of the father, you know, as he's lying, you don't get immediately, or maybe it was just me, when we get to that third stanza about the ventilator, at first you're just seeing this beautifully economic writing about how he builds a wall, you know, the flick of the wrist and swilling him up in the air. You can just see him, a young guy, having done this all his life. It's just second nature. You get that across brilliantly. But then the dad's doing something else. And it's like that fight, you know, once you realise where he is, he's on a ventilator, he's in a bad way. He is still building a wall, you know, whether it's going to be the Tower of Babel, or interestingly for me, the dam that will stop time and tide. I was knocked out with that. You know, this man's still creating stuff. And then the next verse, when he's looking back at a wall, it's solid. But then he's looking up at the ceiling where he, again, the flick of the wrist flicks up his memories. Absolutely. You know, overwhelmingly exciting to read, I thought. But it's the stories, it's your story watching him. Then your kind of story of nirvana, you know, that idea of blowing out. So while we've got the stories there that are concrete, there's a bit where you, in the poem, where you go to the blowing out, and it's just a list of stuff. I wonder, where did that stuff come from? Was that your dad's stories or some of your dad's history, or where did you get all these things? And why did you choose them?
Well, there's that phrase, isn't it, that the world is made up of 10,000 things, but they're all trivial. Yeah. And I guess some of them are my dad's. I remember sitting watching The King and I with my dad.
Michael Portillo's nostrils.
And his nostrils. And I don't really know where a lot of them came from. They just seem to be fragments. I am quite interested in the aesthetics of the fragmentary.
Yeah.
And that kind of sums that up, really, that odd list. And I've got razor blades, but I remember being in the bath as a kid, and our dad shaving and cleaning his razor in the bath while I was in there, and I was going, "Why are you doing that? I'm in the bath." And
yeah, that's what I felt. I felt they were like fragments of your own memories of him. You know, some things you'd done with him. Whether I'm making a joking comment about Portillo's nostrils, but that actually seems kind of abstract, and it's like the kind of thing, if you remember sitting with your dad and he says, "Look at this, you know, a wee thing that's lodged itself somewhere in your subconscious long ago. It's just kind of floated up there." I loved it. I loved that poem, and I thought as well, putting it against this backdrop as well, where you talk about you know, there's just this threat that's there all the time at the back of it, that he might not make it through. And these poems are infused with that, but there's also, I feel, a kind of, whether it's just the amount of lexis and breadth and depth of the lexical choice, it's like that willing to live that's coming through these poems. You know, whether it's you that's want to live, your dad that's to live, you know, your wife that's to live, there's this powerful sense of life in the backdrop of death. You know,
to write myself into life. Try to write myself into life with the exuberance of language.
Absolutely. I mean, you definitely do that, Bob. And, you know, we'll talk after about one of the other poems where, the Witch Time poem, where I think you bring both of you back to full life in that one. But I'm going to pass back over to you to let us hear it, and Shadowlands, if that's what you're going to read. This is Bob Beagrie, folks, if you've just joined.
One thing about this Blowing Out poem that struck me when I read it, once the book was published, though, was that, I mean, I'm talking about my dad, and then I'm using second person, where I'm saying you moved through the space, and then I'm talking about he, and the subject and object are kind of collapsed in it in quite an interesting way that I've never done before. And I think it's because it is kind of a traumatic poem. And I think in trauma, your sense of self and other become kind of confused and blurred. And I think that's one of the things that prose poem is doing, really. You're not sure who you are in the poem and who the poem's about and where you stand in in terms of looking at the subject. So object and subject become a bit confused now. I think that's a really interesting thing, because it's only language that separates us from our sense of self. But anyway, I'll read the...
We'll come back to that, Bob. We'll definitely come back to that. Very interested in that.
Shadow. I said I was going to read Shadowlands, didn't I, as well? So Shadowlands is let's start off with a little epigram from the Sonnets of Orpheus by Rilke. Do not fear to suffer. Cares sink back into the earth again from their heaviness. Heavy are the mountains, heavy are the seas. It became necessary to suspend all sense of disbelief. There was no tree on which to hang your skepticism, like damp laundry on a washing line, socks, panties waving in a sharp sea breeze, one that's travelled miles to say hello to our rootedness. But even that seemed like a vague imago from before, just part and parcel of false memory syndrome. Sure, there was still wind, but how many of us could feel it given the symptoms? I take what I'm allotted and wrap the house around me like a shawl, thankful for its warmth and shelter, the way it acts as an anchor, stops us drifting down the tidal river, between the turbines and out to sea, especially while you're healing, in the tender winds of waiting for bruises to bloom. A bellflower bouquet will forget to set in a vase of water by the window, ends up crumbling dried heads between our fingers. So that was about my, obviously still in the pandemic, but my wife was recovering from a lumpectomy at the time that went septic, and so she had to go back into hospital and get it all cleaned out, and I couldn't visit her or my dad at that time. So and then she came out, and then and was very weak for a while, and it was just about being with her while she's recovering. And so the other one that I wanted to read was called the Witch Time one, which I wrote more recently. I wrote just this summer. Witch Time. This hasn't been published. Just a sec. This time last year, you were in hospital with breast cancer. The year before that, it was still touch and go with your brain hemorrhage, whether or not the surgery would prove successful. But look at us sitting together today. You prod me in the ribs with the stick out of mischief to see how far you can push it, and me trying to read Laurie Lee, stepping out one morning into a world neither of us would recognize. I'm trying to take it all in, this whole dreaming in a gathering of awareness. How I'm dazzled by the glimmer of spring sunlight on the lazy river, how my eyes are lured by the hazy blanket over the land's crooked spine, how I'm mesmerized by the drips from the dipping beak of a swan, let loose by the metronome slice of a paddle, captivated by the black logs' clockwork rotations in the current, surprised by the leap and belly flop of a frog, drawn toward a campfire, smoke trails in the woods, how I'm fixated on counting the railings in the reflection of the bridge, curious to know how long the black coot will stay submerged, how we're led astray by tire tracks and hoof prints imprinted in the mud, how I'm snagged by the water hag's lip as she slips between early blossom trees in rags, collecting washed up odds and ends, fragmentary trophies, like me, like you.
Yeah, we were saying earlier about people trying to rekindle a life. And I know that you had 2 years of hell, and it has been horrific for a lot of people. And that, watching your wife probably near death twice, as well as your father in that situation. But this poem to me is such a kind of celebration of, just from the point, you tell us what the context is, and then there's this beautiful line, and it's so simple, but just look at us sitting here together today. And if I can say, we had spent some time together, the three of us recently, and it was just really heartwarming for me to sit back and watch you two looking at each other across my table every now and then when nothing was being said. I was so aware of it, and I hadn't yet heard the stories that I now know. I just thought, God, how lovely they are. It was like young people, fascinated by one another, and it was beautiful. And then when I heard all the stuff, I thought, no wonder, of course, and then when you say that, it just brought that back to me. Look at us sitting here together. And I thought, yeah, I did look at you sitting there together, and I saw it, like life getting rekindled and love getting re-inspired just because of everything you had been through. And I think the language you use here to what we were saying earlier about grabbing at life, even though you're going into a world we don't know, you're still celebratory of life because of everything. You're fixated on the count of railings and a reflection, mesmerized by drips off a swan, dazzled by this, snagged by that. The whole world is just singing to you again, even though we're over in that pandemic, because she's alive and you've come through it.
Yeah.
It was absolutely fantastic. And I think what's very interesting, what you were saying earlier about the subject and object and pronouns and all that, there is quite a clear sense in this poem of you and the other, he's an us, but it's because you're not going through that, you're watching it. Whereas I think, yes, that poem you did in your dad, there's a collapse of that pronoun between self and other. And I found that really interesting, what you were saying from someone, I know you're quite interested, maybe to say something about that, about Eastern ways of thinking philosophically, where a lot of the work I did was looking at reason, and how it comes through Kant. And his idea, the subjective world, your world, and the objective world, the highest point you can get in the transcendent self is when they come together perfectly. And I thought it was so interesting when you said there, the self disappears and we go out to everything else. And for me, it's like almost a difference between Western philosophy and philosophy of the East, which is so much less about the self and more about melting into otherness, and being part of the world and others. Do you want to say something about your kind of thinking about that?
Yeah, and I think this Which Time poem does that. I'm there with Louise, we're there, but at the same time, I'm melting into all the different details.
Yeah.
And almost becoming them.
Does that happen to you, Bob, if you go out? I don't mean you become the railings, but, do you feel a very, very strong sense of your aesthetic self when you're around, or is it just at heightened times or some of the time? Obviously, you have to go to the shops and get a pint of milk, but, do you find yourself captivated like that during this time or post-lockdown, if we're there yet, or in times of heightened emotion? Is it more that happens?
I do. This idea of self is very interesting, because we seem to have this idea of a given self, but maybe the self is just a verb. Yep. And so in this poem, if self is a verb, then I am all those things, or the phenomenological experience of perceiving them is me. Yep. And there is no other me at that moment. And that is very Zen, isn't it?
It's very Zen. It's very Zen, and it's different from the postmodernist self, which is the becoming, the idea that your performative selves, you perform whoever you are. It's so cool, and it's like, I hate it. Whereas what you've just described to me is a bit an aesthetic paradise, that you can become the thing if you're with it enough. I think the idea of selfing as a verb is amazing. Thank you for that, as I thought. The other poem you read, Shadowlands, Rilke, did you read the German Romantics, or was it him? I mean, that's an amazing, the do not fear to suffer, cares sink back into the earth. It starts off with this promise of change, just hang in there kind of thing. Hang on, it's going to change, But I wondered if Rilke was a particular influence in yours, or you'll enjoy his work.
He is. I really like him, and I like his aesthetics of. There's lots of fragments in his work, and I've taken a lot from that. There's a lot of parallels between his trying to rendering his subjective experience of the world and owning that as reality rather than assuming that there's a reality out there already.
Yeah, I think there's an interesting book. I'm sure is it Jim Morrison? Jim Morrison of The Doors with Rilke. I think if you don't have it, I'll send you the details of that if you've not read it. I'm sure it was him. I read it. It was very interesting. And I also know you've done, and we can talk about that in a minute. I know you've done some fantastic work. I've seen you've written plays, but I know you've supported other people writing plays. We talked about your work with homeless people. I found it really beautiful, and I thought of that when I read this thing, when you're saying during these times, I wrap the house around me like a shawl, and then the house is an anchor. I watched a program on homelessness the other day, and it's a young woman just saying the first thing she does when she's got the opportunity in the film is take people to her home, and her home is like literally a bit that she always goes to, to put her cover down and put her dog there and everything. And you could see it was very important. And apparently, there is a way within the homeless community that nobody else will go there because that's her home. And I felt, God, how difficult to lift the pavement as a shawl around you in times such as these that we're living in. But I wanted to know if you were happy to say something. I know it's outside your poetry, but a wee bit about your work with homeless and playwriting and doing this sort of slam poetry and stuff.
Yeah, because I work for the university part-time, so the other side of my work is more of a writer in the community. So I've done lots of work with all sorts of different interesting groups, from older people in like residential care homes to in schools with year twos to people recovering from addictions to refugees and asylum seekers, teenage mums. Did a really excellent project with teenage mums where we published a book of their poems, then we wrote a play all about it, and they acted. They were the cast in the play, and we took that around a few schools as well.
Great. So I think what's really interesting for me meeting you and reading your poems, which are deep, very aesthetic, very other. People could think of them perhaps as a challenge unless they wake up and just take them a line at a time. They're loaded, but it's such a joy for me to know that doesn't go along with someone who's abstracted into the garret, wrapped around themselves. In fact, the self is, again, clearly what you're doing in your poems, you're doing in your life in terms of trying to open out. So that is just another string to the bow. I loved also in the poem you did, the one about, I like the kind of on the same line, which was unusual. Yet on the same line, obviously Louise after stuff, waiting for bruises to bloom at the end of that poem, but then you've got the bellflower bouquet and they're in the same line, so you're kind of hit with that. But then the bellflowers, they don't bloom because you've been so caught up with this, you don't even remember about them, so they just drift to dust or whatever in your hands as the bruises bloom in illness. That was a fabulous thing to do at the end of that poem. So what's happening next, Bob? You've got an amazing amount of work there. What's happening? If you start working, I've no doubt you are, but if you get more plans for, you want to move away from the pandemic, do you think?
Yeah, yeah, I've written enough about it. I've got another collection that needs a bit of editing. That Yaffle Press, who are in Leeds, have agreed to publish that next year. And that's a completely different thing. It's called Everything Under the Sun. And it's more of a kind of, it's a set of poems that work as a kind of poetic almanac throughout the year. And these are much more kind of pastoral or landscape poems, experiences being out in nature, rather than political or social poems.
And there's no sheep or goats running about nibbling us or anything like that with horns with candles. It's just the country having a good time. And no, I mean, the thing is, I think everyone's had enough, but it's hard for someone who's emotionally engaged in that way and writing in that way to leave it behind, because you would probably have to lock yourself away in some way. I think there'll be a return to it. You know, I've been doing a wee project recently called Looking Back and Going Forward. And I've been working with a group in the community, and basically that is trying to see, you know, what we can learn, and is there anything. We did a thing looking back on mothers, looking back on lovers, looking back on food. Started light and then writing them down the line. Looking back, we started to do food and drinks, and then we went to looking at flight, you know, whether it was flight of the heart, flight of the mind, or flight, and then try to go forward. And it was really interesting, because what that felt to me like was a wee bit of a bridge. And I think all of us maybe will be writing or singing stuff or introducing songs, as I'm doing a wee bit again just now, but with that in mind, but trying to move forward from it, you know, as much as we possibly can. So I'm really looking forward to seeing the new collection. Have you got a title for it? I've got the Whalers one. I've got the Whalers one. I've loved it. What's the new one going to be called?
Everything Under the Sun.
Oh, that's it.
Everything Under the Sun, yeah.
That even sounds celebratory.
Yeah, that's kind of celebratory, yeah. But then I've also been writing for the last few months. I've been writing a sequel to Lee Sung Spell, which is the one that I wrote about the 7th century Anglo-Saxon monk walking from Hartlepool to Whitby. And that was published in 2016. And I realized a little while ago that I hadn't really finished that story. And I wanted to write a sequel to it to finish it off. So I've been working on that over the last few months, and I've just about finished the first draft of this.
So you seem very prolific. You seem to work a lot. Do you sleep?
Yeah, I do, but I do write a lot. Well, writing is a coping mechanism for me. It's a way of figuring out how I feel or what I think, and it's definitely a coping strategy. And it's also an act of resistance.
I think writing's always an act of resistance. It's always an act of, despite us saying how much we can be not ourselves and part of the other, what this does is link up to the other. I mean, writing, you know yourself, if you read something, I mean, I've been reading your work this week, and, you know, a couple of lines, and it's, everybody says, you know, look for the universal when you're teaching, there's something in that. But that just seems to me like, you know, poetry teaching language sometimes. But actually, when it happens to you, when someone just touches you at a place you don't even know, but you might have at another point in your many histories, you just knock sideways. So I would like to say thank you very much for letting me access and having these to read and all the books I've got, and I'll be getting more, because I have to say it's powerful writing, and it's resisting, as you say. It's a way of coping strategy, but more than ever, I think we've all needed that. And you can't touch everybody, but you must be touching many people with this work. So I'd like to say thank you very much.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure to talk to you again.
Thank you for coming on to Poets Time. Hi, everybody out there. This has been Bob Beagrie, and isn't it nice? We've got someone from the Great South with us, a Middlesbrough man who actually was telling me recently he's wanting to find more words from the Black North. Very fascinating. We could talk about many things for hours, but he's digging up language that's disappearing as well, which will appeal very much to a guy I know who's going to watch this, his other friend, Bob, a medievalist who lives in Melbourne. I'll be showing him this film and trying to link you two up. But I'd like to say thank you to Bob Beagrie for joining me today, and thank you to everyone out there remember, we're going forward. It's sunny, and if it rains, the plants are going to love that too. So have a good day and goodbye. Thanks. Bye. Bye, Bob.
Bye-bye.